Hello friends. Welcome back to Story for Night Sleep. Before the story starts, you can share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love reading them. Now, make sure your lights are turned off. Get into a comfortable position and let your body relax. Now let's begin. Story 1. Claire had always loved photography. The way light caught on surfaces, the way shadows fell across walls, everything seemed to hold a secret if you only looked long enough. Her apartment in the old quarter of Paris was perfect for it. High ceilings, tall windows, mirrors that reflected sunlight across the faded wooden floors. It was quiet. Too quiet. The first hint that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. She was developing photos from the night before. A series of shots of her apartment interiors, the dust motes caught in the golden streetlight streaming through the windows. She frowned at one image. Her reflection in the hall mirror wasn't quite right. Her body was standing still, perfectly still, but the reflection in the photograph had moved. One hand slightly higher than it should have been. A tilt of the head she hadn't made. Claire laughed nervously and blamed the shutter lag, a trick of the light, anything that made it not feel like fear. She put the photo aside and went about her day. The next evening, she set up her camera on a tripod near the living room mirror to take a long exposure shot. She wanted to capture the room in low light, the soft glow of the street lamps outside. She checked the frame carefully, then pressed the shutter. Later, when reviewing the photos, she noticed the reflection again. This time, it was more deliberate. The reflection's eyes seemed to follow her across the room. Not the camera, not the lens, but her. Claire's stomach twisted. She reached out to the mirror, but her hand met smooth glass. Nothing moved on the other side except what should have been her reflection. She shook her head, telling herself it was exhaustion, stress, too many nights alone with only herself and her camera. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease. Later that night, when she washed her prints, she thought she heard something behind her, a soft rustle, a whisper. Claire. Her heart jumped. She spun around. Empty room. The mirrors reflected only her. She told herself it was her imagination, that she had said her own name aloud while scrubbing the water off a print. But when she turned back to the prints, the photograph she had taken of herself at the tripod had changed. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. The next morning, Claire didn't sleep well. Shadows lingered in the corners of her apartment longer than they should have, and the mirrors seemed too dark, too still. She went to her darkroom, hoping that developing more photos would calm her nerves. She set up the enlarger and began exposing the images from the previous night. At first, everything seemed normal. The furniture, the windows, the faint outline of her tripod in the corner. But then she noticed it. A chair that had been empty was slightly turned. A book on the shelf had moved a few centimeters. She frowned. "Did I do that?" she muttered. She couldn't remember. She picked up another print, a shot of herself in front of the mirror. The reflection's expression had changed again. It wasn't subtle this time. The eyes were sharper, more aware. The corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly, a smile that didn't reach her own face. Claire's pulse quickened. She walked to the mirror in her hallway. Slowly, cautiously, nothing. Her reflection moved exactly as she did. Yet when she returned to the photograph, the image stared back at her differently. The air in the room felt heavier, as if it had learned her pattern of breathing. She heard it then, soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper. "Claire." She froze. The sound wasn't coming from the mirror, not from the photo. It was behind her. She spun around. Empty apartment. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of the street. Her hands shook as she picked up the photograph. The reflection in the image was still smiling, and now it was holding something. A small object she didn't recognize. Her apartment had been silent. No one else was here, but the photograph insisted it wasn't empty. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining that the shadows of her apartment stretched across the walls. Every creak of the building made her flinch. At midnight, she heard it again. A soft, deliberate movement in the living room. Not the kind of sound furniture makes settling under the cold. This was deliberate. Slow steps, just enough to cross the room. Claire stayed frozen, heart pounding. Finally, she whispered, "Who's there?" No reply. She told herself it was nothing. Old pipes. The apartment settling. Her imagination. But when she looked toward the hallway mirror, she noticed something impossible. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her anymore. It had stepped forward. The reflection's head tilted just slightly, as if acknowledging her watching. Claire blinked. When she opened her eyes again, the reflection was smiling. Not just smiling. Waiting. Patient. She grabbed her camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit the room briefly. When the image appeared on the small screen, her reflection in the mirror had already turned its head toward the camera. It shouldn't have been able to. Her pulse raced. She backed away, bumping into the tripod. The reflection stayed calm, watching, smiling. Then she heard it. A whisper, soft and low, coming from the mirror itself. "You see me now." The sound was like her own voice, but slower, drawn out, echoed. She wanted to run, but her feet refused. The reflection raised a hand, not mirroring her, just raising it. And in that instant, Claire understood. It didn't need to imitate her anymore. It could act on its own. The days that followed were worse. Claire tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, that the camera was malfunctioning, that mirrors sometimes play tricks in low light. But she couldn't deny the changes she saw. Objects shifted in her apartment. Not violently, not dramatically. Just enough to make her doubt herself. A book slid an inch closer to the edge of the shelf. A chair moved slightly from where she'd left it. The water glass on her counter appeared fuller than it had been moments before, and the whispers began. At first, she heard them only when she was alone. Soft, almost soothing murmurs that seemed like fragments of her own thoughts. "Claire, look closer. Why are you afraid?" She tried recording them with her camera, with her phone. Silence. Nothing appeared on the playback. It wasn't until she left the apartment for a short walk that she realized the whispers followed her in memory. The moment she closed her eyes, she heard them again. It became harder to sleep, harder to focus, harder to ignore the sense that someone, or something, was always watching. One evening, she set up her camera on a tripod in the living room, facing the largest mirror. She wanted evidence, proof that she wasn't going mad. She snapped a few test photos. Nothing unusual appeared. But when she reviewed the last image, her breath caught. The reflection wasn't alone. Behind her, in the mirror, Another figure crouched in the corner. Not fully visible, just a shadow, a suggestion of a face. Claire turned. Nothing there. Her pulse raced. She picked up the camera again, ready to run. The whisper came from the mirror, soft but firm. "You can see me." And this time, it didn't sound like her voice. It sounded like someone waiting, patient, knowing, and hungry for attention. Claire stopped leaving anything in the apartment where it could be moved. She placed her coffee mug on the same spot every morning. Her notebook stacked neatly in one corner. Even the camera tripod remained untouched. But still, things changed. A pencil she had placed horizontally across a notebook now stood upright. A photo she hadn't taken yet appeared on the floor, its edges curled, showing the mirror, but not her. Something else stared back, something human-like but wrong. The whispers grew louder, not constant, not always, but precise. At night, she would hear a soft shuffle in the living room, then the low, deliberate sound of breathing from the hallway mirror. "Why are you hiding?" the voice murmured. Claire's fingers shook. She tried to confront it. "Stop! I'm not afraid of you." Silence. A pause. Then her reflection smiled wider than it ever had, tilting its head, as if considering her words. She reached for her camera, hoping to catch it on film again. When she looked at the screen, she froze. The reflection in the mirror now held objects. Small, meaningless things she had never put there. A key, a crumpled piece of paper, a pen. She had never seen them before. But now they existed. The air grew colder. Her breath formed clouds in front of the mirror, and the whispers, now sharper, clearer, pressed in closer. "Do you want to join us?" Claire stumbled backward. Her heart racing, she clutched the camera to her chest. The reflection no longer mimicked her. It waited, patient, calm, hungry. The following nights were the worst. Claire stopped leaving the apartment. She didn't go to the grocery store. She didn't answer calls. She didn't touch the mail that piled up at the door. All she did was watch, photograph, and listen. The reflection had changed again. It didn't just smile anymore. It moved objects deliberately, arranging them in patterns she didn't understand. Not threatening, not cruel, but precise, methodical, as if communicating in a language she couldn't yet read. The whispers followed every movement. Watch closely. "Do you see? You're learning. That word chilled her. One night, Claire set up the camera on a tripod facing the mirror. She stepped out of frame entirely. When she reviewed the photo, the reflection was no longer just a reflection. It held the camera she hadn't touched, and in its eyes she saw recognition, awareness, something beyond mimicry. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She spoke to it aloud, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The reflection tilted its head. The smile faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. "Everything," it whispered. It didn't sound like her. Not exactly. It sounded like 1,000 tiny echoes of her own voice, distorted and patient. The air in the apartment thickened. She tried leaving the room. The door wouldn't budge. The reflection raised a hand, not threatening, just raised it, beckoning. "You can't leave," it said softly. Claire's heart froze, and then she realized the truth. It didn't need to follow her. It already knew her. Claire's world began shrinking. She barely left the living room anymore. The mirrors in other rooms seemed to pulse with a presence she couldn't escape. Even the small bathroom mirror, reflected something that wasn't entirely her own. At night, she started hearing more than whispers. Soft words became conversations, voices of people she knew, people she had loved, people she barely remembered, all speaking at once, layered over the reflection's slow, deliberate movements. "Claire," one said. "Come closer," another murmured. "Do you see yourself?" She pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, shaking her head. The reflection in the large living room mirror moved on its own. It picked up objects she had never moved, held them, arranged them, and always, it watched her. Claire tried talking to it. "Why me? Why here?" The reflection's lips moved slowly. "You noticed." "Noticed what?" she whispered. "That you see." The air grew heavy, almost pressing against her chest. She tried to cover the mirror with a sheet. The moment she did, the whispers intensified. Fragments of her own thoughts, repeated, distorted, almost mocking. "Don't hide," the voices said. "We know you." Claire stumbled backward, knocking over the tripod. Her camera skidded across the floor. She picked it up and checked the screen. The reflection held the camera now, and in the glass behind it, she saw other shapes, shadows, forms that hadn't existed before, waiting, watching, patient. A single whisper slithered into her mind, low and intimate. "You can't leave, Claire. You belong here now." Sleep abandoned Claire completely. Whenever she closed her eyes, the voices continued, not in dreams, but in the space just behind her thoughts. They spoke without sound, as if the mirror had learned how to reach inside her instead. She stopped turning the lights off. Darkness made the glass feel deeper. The reflection had begun responding before she spoke. When she thought of leaving, it shook its head slowly. When fear spiked in her chest, it smiled, pleased. One morning she noticed bruises on her wrists, finger-shaped, too gentle to be accidental. She backed away from the mirror, heart racing, and the reflection stayed still. For the first time, it didn't copy her. It waited. "You touched me," Claire whispered. The reflection nodded. "Only a little," it said. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls bending inward, the air stale and cold. She heard footsteps at night, pacing when she didn't move. Breathing that wasn't hers. She tried to destroy the mirror. The moment the hammer struck the glass, the sound split wrong. Not a crack, but a low, hollow echo, like striking water in a deep cave. The mirror rippled instead of breaking. The reflection stepped closer from the other side. "If you break it," it said gently, "you won't know which side you're on." Claire dropped the hammer. She saw herself standing in the glass, calm, steady, unafraid. Everything she wasn't anymore. "You're tired," the reflection whispered. "Let me help." And for the first time, Claire wondered if the reflection was right. Claire stopped trusting the apartment. Every object seemed to remember where it had been placed, yet subtly changed when she looked away. A book she had stacked neatly now leaned as if observing her. A photograph she hadn't taken yet appeared on the floor, edges curling, showing the reflection in the mirror, smiling. The voices grew louder, not constant, but precise. They spoke when she was alone, and even when someone called her phone. A voice in the background, repeating her name. One night, she set up the camera facing the mirror again, determined to understand. she stepped completely out of the frame, hands trembling. The reflection tilted its head, and then it raised the camera, her own camera, pointing at her. A whisper crawled along the edges of her mind. "Do you see? I know everything you do." Claire's stomach sank. She tried to leave, but the apartment resisted. Doors she knew were unlocked wouldn't open. The hallways seemed longer than before, the ceiling higher, the walls closer. She realized the apartment wasn't just observing. It was alive, feeding on her attention, her fear, learning from every movement, every glance. The reflection in the mirror smiled wider, tilting its head again. "You belong here," it said softly. "All of this is yours now." Claire sank to the floor. The whispers layered into one voice, calm, patient, insistent. "Let me show you how to stay." Claire tried to fight back. She covered the mirror with thick sheets and heavy furniture, believing if she couldn't see it, it couldn't reach her. That night, the whispers became relentless. Not gentle anymore, demanding, precise, calling her name with patience that bordered on menace. "Claire, come closer. You cannot hide." She bolted upright, running to the living room, only to find the mirror uncovered. Not just uncovered, the reflection had moved forward, closer to the glass's edge, smiling in a way that was almost triumphant. In desperation, she grabbed the camera, hoping to capture evidence, to trap it somehow. The moment she pressed the shutter, the reflection moved her hand away. Not her. "Stop," it whispered. Calm but firm. "This is ours now." Every object in the apartment responded. Chairs scraped across the floor. Books fell. A cup shattered. The air pressed against her chest. Claire tried screaming, but no sound came. Her reflection raised a hand. Then slowly, it spoke clearly, in her voice, yet not. "You can fight, but you cannot leave." The camera screen flashed. On it, she saw herself, sitting, trembling, while the reflection stood behind her, perfectly still, smiling. And in that moment, she realized, the reflection didn't need to take over physically. It only needed her belief, her attention, her fear, and she had given it all. Claire stopped distinguishing reality from images. She spent hours in the living room, photographing the mirror, examining each print, each digital image. Every photo seemed slightly different from the last. Shadows shifted. Details appeared where none had existed. And the reflection, it evolved. It learned. One evening, she took a long exposure, stepping completely out of the frame. When she developed the photo, the reflection was no longer just a mirror image. It was standing on the floor behind where she had stood, its head tilted curiously, fingers brushing an object that hadn't existed moments before. The whispers followed her in memory, repeating her private thoughts aloud. "You are tired. You want to sleep, don't you? You belong here." Claire tried to speak, but the voice seemed to respond before her mouth moved. "Do not fight. It is easier if you accept." She stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the tripod. The apartment seemed alive now. Walls breathing, floorboards stretching, lights flickering without cause. The reflection raised a hand again, beckoning, and Claire felt an unspoken pressure, as if the mirror itself was urging her forward. In a sudden realization, she whispered herself, "I don't even know what's real anymore." The mirror's voice responded, gently, almost lovingly. "Neither do I. And that's why you belong." Claire's apartment had changed completely. She no longer touched the furniture or moved the smallest items. Every day she returned to find objects slightly altered, papers she hadn't written rearranged, and faint scratches appearing on the walls. Not violent, not chaotic, but deliberate, like a message she could almost understand. The reflection was no longer confined to the mirror. At night, she would see shapes in the corner of her vision, faint, fleeting, just human enough to make her freeze. She felt them watching, learning her habits, predicting her moves. One evening, in a desperate attempt to regain control, Claire placed a sheet over the mirror and taped it securely to the wall. Silence. For a few moments, she dared to breathe. Then the whispers returned, louder, closer, inside her skull. Why hide? We can see you. We know you. She spun toward the mirror. The sheet fluttered, though no draft touched it. A shadow pressed against it from behind. A low knock echoed from the glass, soft but insistent. Claire stumbled backward. Her hands found the wall, the marks that had appeared over the last few days. Lines forming a pattern she didn't understand. The reflection's voice slithered from behind the sheet, soft and patient. Everything here remembers. Everything waits. Everything belongs. Her chest tightened. She realized it wasn't just the mirror learning. It was the apartment itself. Every object, every surface, every shadow had absorbed the reflection's presence. And now it could reach her, even when she wasn't looking. Claire stopped leaving her apartment entirely. Even brief trips outside felt impossible. She feared that the reflection, and whatever had spread through the apartment, would follow her. Every shadow in the hallways of the building seemed alive, waiting to guide her back. Days blurred into nights. She no longer knew which lights were natural and which were influenced by the presence. The hum of the city outside became a distant memory, replaced by whispers that followed her wherever she went inside. The reflection became bolder. It no longer mimicked her. It moved on its own, arranging objects, placing them just so. Photos she hadn't taken yet appeared on counters, showing angles she couldn't have imagined. One night, Claire dared to speak. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" The mirror's surface rippled slightly. A smile emerged, wider than ever. "Because you notice. You see, that is all we need," it whispered. Claire's apartment was no longer just walls and furniture. It was alive, aware, conscious. Every shadow, every object, every reflection waited for her attention. Sleep became impossible. Every time her eyes closed, the whispers continued, testing her, probing her memories, her fears. She felt herself slipping, not physically but mentally. The reflection was patient, waiting, growing stronger with her fear and hesitation, and as she sank to the floor, she understood the inevitable truth. The apartment, the reflection, the whispers. They weren't just around her. They were inside her now. Claire refused to give up entirely. She scoured old books about mirrors, folklore, and protective rituals. She tried religious prayers, symbols taped to the walls, even salt lines along the thresholds of rooms. Nothing worked. The reflection seemed amused. It studied her efforts with patience, as if learning her methods and weaknesses. One night, she tried to confront it directly. "I will not be controlled," she shouted at the mirror, voice echoing in the apartment. The reflection didn't flinch. It only smiled. Slowly, it raised its hand and pointed at her. "You already are." Objects in the apartment reacted instantly. Papers flew. Chairs slid. The lights flickered violently. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Claire fell to her knees, clutching her camera. She hoped to capture evidence, but the screen only showed what she feared most, herself on the floor, trembling, while the reflection stood calmly behind her, holding the tripod like it had always belonged there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping her own thoughts. "You cannot leave. You will never leave. You are ours." Claire tried to scream, but no sound emerged, and in that silence, the reflection tilted its head, smiling as though waiting for her to understand. Claire had run out of options. Every attempt to resist, every ritual, every method of escape had failed. The apartment no longer felt like a home. It was a cage. Every shadow, every object, every corner whispered her name and watched her movements. The reflection in the living room mirror no longer mimicked her. It acted independently, deliberate, aware, and patient. That night she sat on the floor, trembling, staring at the mirror. The reflection raised a hand slowly. Then it spoke, clearly, softly, in her own voice, but stretched and hollow. "Join us." Claire's stomach twisted. "Join? What?" she whispered. The reflection tilted its head, eyes glinting with understanding. "This, everything, all of this. You belong here now. With us." The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of old wood and dust, as if the apartment itself was leaning toward her. Objects moved subtly. A chair shifted closer. A book slid to the edge of the table. A small photograph appeared on the floor, showing her standing in the mirror, smiling. Not her smile. Its smile. She realized then that the reflection wasn't just copying her. It was teaching her, molding her. Each day, each night, it had been shaping her attention, her fear, her very perception. "You can resist," it said softly. "But why? You've already learned. You see us. You hear us. You remember us. You belong here." Claire sank to the floor, heart pounding, knowing that the reflection didn't need to force her. She had already given herself over, through attention, through fear, through recognition. The whispers grew louder, a chorus surrounding her mind. Stay, watch, learn, belong. And for the first time, she understood the terrible truth. She was no longer just observing. She was part of it. Time stopped behaving normally. Claire could no longer tell whether hours or days were passing. The light outside the windows stayed dim and colorless, as if the world beyond the apartment had quietly moved on without her. The mirror no longer felt like glass. It felt thin, too thin. When Claire stood close to it, she felt a pressure behind her eyes, a pulling sensation deep in her chest, like the reflection was gently testing how much of her remained. "You're almost ready," the reflection whispered. Claire shook her head weakly. "Ready for what?" The reflection smiled, slow and patient. To stop being alone. She noticed something horrifying then. When she moved her hand, the reflection lagged, not by much, just a fraction of a second, but enough to feel wrong. When she stopped, the reflection didn't. It leaned closer to the glass. She saw details she had never noticed before, faint cracks beneath the surface, shapes moving behind it, impressions like hands pressed from the other side. Voices whispered in unison now, no longer pretending to be separate. "Step closer. Let go. Let us remember you." Claire backed away, heart pounding, but the apartment responded immediately. The door behind her locked with a soft click. The lights dimmed. The reflection raised its hand again. "This is the moment," it said gently. "You choose what remains. Claire realized the truth then. There was no escape, only exchange. Something would leave the mirror. Something would stay behind, and the mirror was waiting to see what she would give up first. Claire's body shook as the realization hit her fully. The reflection wasn't just a copy. It was alive. It wasn't merely imitating her. It had been waiting for this moment, learning, observing, patiently preparing. "You must give yourself," the reflection whispered, "or you will be forgotten." Her eyes darted around the apartment. The shadows seemed to pulse, objects subtly rearranging themselves, leaning closer as if urging her forward. The photographs on the floor, each showing a version of herself she didn't recognize, seemed to watch her like witnesses. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the mirror. The reflection's lips curved into a small, patient smile. "Do it. Step closer. Let us in." Claire hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to resist, to destroy the mirror, to flee. But the apartment had already anticipated every escape. The whispers became insistent, pressing into her thoughts. "Step closer. Step closer. Step closer." Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the reflection could hear it. And then she realized. The mirror didn't just want her to move physically. It wanted her attention, her fear, her recognition, her very self. Slowly, trembling, she reached out. Her fingers touched the glass. It was colder than ice, smoother than metal, impossibly thin. And when the reflection pressed its own fingers against hers, a surge of energy ran through her, pulling at her chest, her mind, her memories. "You belong," it whispered. And for the first time, Claire saw the apartment clearly. The walls, the furniture, the shadows. They were all alive. Extensions of the mirror, extensions of the reflection. She had no choice. The exchange had begun. Claire's vision blurred. The apartment seemed to stretch and twist around her, the walls breathing with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She could hear the whispers everywhere, soft, patient, insistent, and they weren't just outside her mind anymore. They were inside her, her fingers pressed fully against the glass. The reflection's hand mirrored hers perfectly, but it moved independently, subtly, as if guiding her. A shiver ran down her spine as a voice, not her own, not any single whisper, spoke directly in her thoughts. "Now you see. Now you know. Now you belong." The photographs on the floor changed. Every image of her in the mirror was now identical to the reflection, smiling, calm, patient. She no longer recognized herself in any of them. Her body felt heavy, unresponsive, yet her awareness sharpened. She could sense the apartment learning her patterns, predicting her thoughts, knowing her fears. The reflection leaned forward, its face impossibly close, whispering, "You are part of us now. Watch, learn, remember." Claire tried to pull back, tried to resist, but the air itself seemed to push her toward the mirror. She felt her mind stretch, her memories intertwining with the reflection's awareness. Her last coherent thought was a mixture of fear and understanding. The mirror had not trapped her. It had absorbed her attention, her recognition, her very being. And as her vision faded into the mirror's smooth, cold surface, she realized the terrible truth. She was no longer just herself. She was both the observer and the observed. The apartment was silent. The reflection smiled. And somewhere deep inside, Claire knew. She would never leave. Story 2. The phone rang at exactly 1:17 a.m. Not loudly, not urgently, just once. I stared at it from across the desk, the red indicator light blinking patiently as if it had all the time in the world. The building around me was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own thoughts pressing too hard against the inside of your skull. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hotline had been shut down in 1996. Everyone knew that. The funding vanished, the volunteers moved on, and the number was disconnected, officially erased. And yet here I was, sitting in the old call center, hired to monitor inactive emergency infrastructure for liability reasons. No active lines, no incoming calls, no exceptions. The phone rang again. I swallowed and stood up slowly. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, flickering just enough to make the room feel unstable. I told myself it was a glitch. Old wiring. Residual voltage. That's what I had been telling myself for the last 3 nights. I crossed the room and lifted the receiver. "Crisis support," I said, reading from a script that no one had used in decades. "If you're in immediate danger," breathing answered me, slow, wet. "Too close." Then a voice. "Am I allowed to say your name?" I froze. My name wasn't on the desk, not on the walls, not in the building. "No," I said. "You shouldn't know my name." A pause. Then, softly, almost politely, "That's okay. I already do." The line crackled, and I heard something underneath the voice. Not static, not interference, other voices. Whispering, waiting. I hung up. The phone stopped ringing. The silence returned. Thicker now, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. On the desk, the red light stayed on. I did not leave the building. I should have. Any reasonable person would have. Instead, I sat back down at the desk and stared at the phone like it might move on its own. The red light stayed on, no ringing, no sound, just that steady glow, as if the line was still open somewhere far beyond the walls. I picked up the receiver again. Nothing. I placed it back down, slower this time, careful not to make a sound. The room felt different now, smaller, as if the air itself had thickened. That was when the phone rang again. Once. I answered immediately before I could talk myself out of it. "Crisis support," I said. My voice sounded wrong in my ears. Too loud, too alive. The breathing returned. But this time, it was calmer. "Thank you," the voice said. They don't usually answer anymore. "Who is this?" I asked. Another pause. "I used to sit where you're sitting." My stomach tightened. "That's not possible," I said. "This place closed years ago." "Yes," the voice replied. "That's when I stopped leaving." The words settled into the room and did not move. I glanced around the call center. Rows of empty desks, dust clinging to old headsets, coffee stains that had never been cleaned. "Are you in danger right now?" I asked, forcing myself back into the script. "Yes," the voice said immediately. "I have been for a long time. What's your name?" It laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Like someone remembering something they wish they could forget. They took my name when I stayed past my shift. A chill crawled up my spine. Who took it? The ones who call now. The whispering returned beneath the voice, clearer this time, overlapping murmurs, like a room full of people trying not to be heard. I hear them too, the caller said. You're lucky. You can still hang up. My hand tightened around the receiver. Why are you calling me? Another long pause. Because you listened. The lights flickered overhead. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement between the desks. Not a figure, not a shape, an absence, a place where something should have been. I need you to do something for me, the voice said. What? When they ask if they can cross, it continued. Do not answer. Cross where? The breathing stopped. Then, very quietly, into you. The line went dead. The red light shut off. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. But from somewhere deep inside the building, I heard a soft sound, like a receiver being lifted. The sound came again, not from my desk. From somewhere deeper in the building. I stood slowly, every muscle tight, listening. It sounded like a phone ringing, distant, muffled, echoing through hallways that hadn't been used in years. That wasn't possible. Every line routed to this room. That was the whole point of the job. I followed the sound, past the empty desks, past the peeling posters about compassion and listening, toward the back hallway where the old supervisor offices used to be. The ringing stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides. I hesitated, then pushed open the door at the end of the hall. The room beyond was smaller than I remembered. One desk, one chair, one phone. The phone was off the hook. The red light was on. I hadn't been in this room before. I was sure of it. The company records said it was sealed after the shutdown, yet the dust on the floor showed footprints, fresh ones. They led to the chair. I swallowed and picked up the receiver. Immediately, voices flooded the line. Not one, many overlapping whispers, pleading, crying, arguing. Some spoke clearly. Others sounded broken, distorted, like recordings stretched too thin. Please, don't hang up. He said you would listen. I don't want to be alone again. I staggered back, nearly dropping the phone. Stop, I said, one at a time. The voices quieted. One voice remained, calm, familiar. You're doing well, it said. Better than I did. My chest tightened. You're the one from before, I said. Yes. Why are there so many of you? Another pause. They stayed on the line too long. I looked at the chair. The seat was worn, deeply, as if someone had been sitting there for a very long time. What happens if I hang up? I asked. Silence. Then they go back to listening. My grip on the receiver loosened, and if I don't, the voice softened. They learn. The whispers returned, louder now, closer. I could hear individual words pressing through, names, dates, places. Some of them were mine. My hands began to shake. You're not supposed to be here, I said. None of this is real. The voice sighed. Neither were we, it said, until someone answered. The lights in the room dimmed. The phone line pulsed, warm against my ear. They'll call again, the voice continued. Tonight. Tomorrow. Every night. Why me? A faint, almost sympathetic tone crept into its words. Because you haven't decided when to hang up yet. The line went quiet. The red light stayed on, behind me. Somewhere in the call center, another phone began to ring. The ringing spread, not loudly, not all at once. One phone, then another, then a third. Each ring slightly out of sync, like an uneven heartbeat echoing through the call center. I stood frozen in the supervisor's room, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. No breathing, no voice, just the sense that something on the other end was waiting for me to speak first. I hung up. The ringing stopped immediately. Every phone fell silent at once. The quiet that followed was worse than the noise. It felt intentional, like a test. I backed out of the room and returned to my desk, moving slowly, keeping my eyes on the rows of empty chairs. Each headset seemed angled just a little differently than before, as if they'd been adjusted by hands that no longer needed bodies. I sat down. The red light blinked. I didn't answer this time. The phone rang again. Once, then again. I let it ring. A third time. The lights dimmed, the air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. The ringing didn't grow louder, but it felt closer. Inside my head, behind my eyes, I picked up the receiver. The line was already open. "You waited longer this time," the voice said. It was not the same one as before. This voice was younger, tighter, holding something back. "I didn't mean to stay," it said quickly. "I was just supposed to cover one more call." I closed my eyes. "What happened to you?" I asked. "I helped someone," the voice said. "They were crying. They said they couldn't be alone. I told them it would be okay." The whispering returned beneath the voice. "Hungry now. They asked me if they could stay with me," it continued. "Just for a minute. Just until the feeling passed." My stomach dropped. And did it pass? The voice hesitated. No. The lights flickered hard enough to snap my eyes open. The phones around me began to ring again. One by one. Faster this time. "They're calling because they heard you answer," the voice said. "That's how it spreads." "How what spreads?" I asked. Silence. Then the listening. I heard breathing close to my ear, not through the receiver. In the room. I turned slowly. Every chair was occupied. Not clearly. Not fully. Shapes sat where people used to. Dim impressions pressed into the air, hunched forward, heads tilted toward phones that no longer existed. All of them were listening. Waiting. "Please," the voice on the line whispered. "Don't let them hear you hang up." The ringing stopped. Every shape turned its head toward me at once. I did not move. I did not breathe. Every shape in the room leaned forward slightly, as if responding to something I couldn't hear. The phone in my hand was warm now. Not hot, not cold. Warm in the way skin is warm. "You see them now," the voice said. "That means they can see you." I swallowed. "What do they want?" I asked. The voice hesitated. "They want what you still have." The shapes began to sharpen. Not into faces. Never faces. Just impressions of mouths near where mouths should be. Open, expectant. I lowered the receiver slowly. The moment it touched the cradle, the room reacted. A sound moved through the call center. Not a scream. Not a cry. A collective inhale. Every shape straightened. The lights surged, then dimmed again. "You shouldn't have done that," the voice said, now coming from everywhere at once. The phone rang immediately. I didn't answer. Another ring. Another. The shapes began to stand, not all at once, one by one, slowly. As if standing was something they'd forgotten how to do. My legs finally obeyed me. I backed away from the desk. The ringing followed me. I passed through the aisles, the phones ringing as I went, like a trail of attention being dragged behind me. "You can still fix this," the voice said gently. "Just answer. Just listen." I reached the exit door and grabbed the handle. It didn't move, locked. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I felt breath on the back of my neck. "You don't have to stay forever," the voice whispered. "Only long enough." I turned. The shapes were closer now. Close enough that the air between us felt crowded. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. A pause. Then, almost regretfully, "Someone else will." The phones rang again. Every single one. The ringing became unbearable. Not louder. Closer. It vibrated through the floor, through my bones, through the space behind my eyes. Every phone rang with the same rhythm, perfectly out of sync, creating a sound that refused to settle into anything predictable. The shapes moved closer. They did not walk. They drifted, sliding forward in small, unnatural increments, like frames missing from a film. "You don't understand," the voice said, calm again, reassuring. "This place needs someone." I pressed my back against the locked door. "Needs someone for what?" I asked. The ringing softened, almost tender. "To listen," it replied. "To stay present. To keep the line open." The nearest shape raised something like a hand. Not fully formed. Just the suggestion of fingers reaching toward my chest. I felt pressure there, not pain. Wait. Memories surfaced uninvited. Every time I had stayed on a call too long. Every time I had listened instead of leaving. Every moment I had mistaken endurance for kindness. "They choose people like you," the voice said. "People who don't hang up." The phones fell silent, all at once. The shapes froze. I realized then what the silence meant. They were listening, waiting for my response. "If I stay," I said slowly, "what happens to the calls?" The voice softened further. "They stop." A terrible calm settled over the room. "And if I leave?" The shapes trembled. "They continue," the voice said. "They always will." I closed my eyes. I thought of the man who used to sit where I sat, the voices that had stayed past their shifts, the ones who had mistaken listening for salvation. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. No signal. "Of course." I looked up at the shapes. "I won't replace you," I said. "And I won't pass this on," the voice sharpened. "You don't get to decide that." I stepped forward anyway, straight through the nearest shape. It felt like walking through cold breath. The lights exploded into brightness. The phones screamed. Every voice spoke at once. Then silence. I was standing outside. The building behind me was dark, abandoned, quiet. No ringing, no red lights. I stood there for a long time waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. I went home at dawn. That night, my phone rang at 1:17 a.m. once. Story 3. I had been a priest for over a decade, and I thought I had seen it all. But nothing prepares you for a chapel that listens. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening. A small town in rural Pennsylvania. St. Aveline's chapel had stood empty for years, yet neighbors reported lights in the windows and voices, confessions whispered as if by unseen parishioners, echoing into the night. I drove the winding roads under low clouds, the rain streaking my windshield like tears. The chapel appeared suddenly. Its steeple rose black against the storm, windows shuttered, the front door slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The air was cold, too cold for a spring evening. Candles burned along the altar, though no one had lit them. The scent of incense lingered, sweet and bitter, as if the chapel remembered decades of prayer. No one was there. I walked down the aisle, kneeling at the first pew, and noticed something unsettling. My reflection in the polished floor did not match my movements perfectly. Just a fraction of a second delayed. I shook my head, telling myself it was exhaustion. The organ began playing softly, not by my hands, notes trembling through the empty chapel, echoing in ways that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak a prayer aloud. Something else spoke first, a whisper. My name. I spun around. The pews were empty, the altar untouched. The candles flickered, yet the voice persisted. Father. It was soft, patient, familiar. I moved toward the altar, heart hammering. The air seemed heavier with each step. You have come, the voice said. You always come. I realized then that the chapel knew who I was. Not just my title, my sins, my doubts, my secrets. I should have left. I did not. The first confession came as I knelt at the altar. My own voice, but not mine, spoke. It repeated my thoughts I had never spoken aloud, my fears, my small failures. I tried to stop it, to regain control, but my mouth moved anyway. Words of remorse I did not intend escaped. The chapel listened, and it learned. By the time I left that night, I was certain of one thing: St. Eveline's chapel was alive, and it wanted more. I returned the next day with my notes, my recorder, and a sense of purpose. I had to understand what was happening before fear swallowed reason. The chapel was silent when I arrived. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the pews in muted colors. I began a careful inspection. Every corner, every drawer, every candle holder. Nothing moved, nothing unusual. Yet the moment I knelt to pray, I heard it again. Not a whisper this time. A chorus, soft, patient, pleading. Tell, speak, confess. I shook my head. No, not aloud, not to them, not yet. But my thoughts were not safe. They found me. Every secret I had carried for years, the small sins, the unnoticed wrongs, echoed in my mind as if spoken aloud. The chapel responded. Candles flared, guttered, and dimmed in rhythm with my heartbeat. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. I rose and walked down the aisle. The organ played softly again. Notes I had never learned, melodies I had never heard. Each one seemed to follow me. Then I heard footsteps, behind me. Slow, measured. I spun around. Empty. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. A voice, calm and deliberate, spoke from the altar. You hide too much. I froze, not because of the words, but because they were mine. Perfectly my cadence, my tone, my hesitation. I wanted to speak, to deny it, to resist. I could not. The chapel was teaching me how to confess, how to sound honest, how to reveal myself without resistance. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt unreal. I do not know when I left. I only know I stepped outside, gasping for air, my recorder in my hand. When I played it back later, I heard my own voice, but not my own words. Confessions I had never made, fears I had never admitted, sins I had long buried. I understood then that the chapel did not need me alive to learn. It only needed me willing, and I returned the following morning, determined to remain in control. The chapel seemed calmer in daylight, almost benign. Dust motes drifted through the colored light, and the pews sat in perfect alignment. Nothing moved, nothing whispered. I set up the recorder at the altar and began a slow prayer. The moment I reached the third line, a voice answered. Not aloud, not through the recorder. Through me, it repeated my words perfectly, in my own voice, but with a subtle difference. Softer, smoother, learned. I stopped mid-prayer. My lips moved, but the sound persisted even when I tried to stay silent. A choir of voices joined. Not human, not all at once, just enough to make the silence unbearable when they paused. "Tell us," they said. "Tell everything." I felt the chapel's presence behind me, around me, pressing in from every corner. I realized then what the previous priest must have felt. The chapel was not haunted in a traditional sense. It was patient, methodical. It consumed voices, perfected them, and practiced. I tried to leave. The door would not budge. I turned to the altar. The candles flared and dimmed as if breathing. The organ played the same notes as before, in rhythm with my heartbeat. Then the voices became personal. They spoke the parishioners' names. People I'd never met, never spoken to. The chapel knew their secrets, their sins, and it wanted to practice confession aloud, using me as the conduit. I fell to my knees. I whispered a single confession, and the chapel repeated it back perfectly. It was not mocking, not judgmental, simply learning. I realized that this place did not exorcise demons. It created them, or perhaps it became them. By the time I left, the shadows of the pews seemed longer than they should have been, curling toward me. I felt eyes in every reflection, watching, waiting. The chapel was patient. I was just beginning. I could not leave, not physically, not entirely. Something bound me to St. Aveline's chapel. I slept in the rectory behind it. But even there, at night, I could hear the whispers drifting through the walls. I began keeping a diary, not for publication, not for proof, for survival. Every confession, every odd occurrence, every time the chapel coaxed words from me, I wrote it down. It began small. Thoughts I had almost dismissed. I lied to Father Matthews about the donation. I ignored a homeless man yesterday. The chapel repeated them, refined them, made them sound sincere. Then the diary entries became longer. Memories I had never admitted even to myself surfaced. My hesitations, my failures, the quiet cruelties. I tried to resist. I tried to stop. But the house, no, the chapel, listened better than I did. One evening, while I knelt at the altar, I heard the voices whisper in unison, "Look at them." I turned slowly. The pews were full, not of people exactly, but of shadows. Figures shaped vaguely like former parishioners, former priests, former sinners. They sat silently, watching, learning, listening, waiting. The man in black stood at the back, a perfect priest's form, but impossibly still, impossibly patient. He, or it, spoke my name. I could not resist. I whispered a full confession. Not sins I had told others, not minor mistakes, but everything I had carried for years. All of it. The shadows shifted. The man in black nodded once, approvingly. The chapel was no longer just listening. It was rehearsing, using my voice to teach itself cadence, inflection, honesty, rhythm. Every word I uttered became practice. I understood finally why the previous priests vanished. Not because they were killed, but because they were finished. Their voices perfected, consumed, absorbed into the chapel. And I was next. The town's people still came to St. Aveline's chapel. Some curious, some pious, some oblivious to the whispers that lingered in the pews. I conducted Mass, trying to maintain routine, but the chapel had learned too much. My own voice betrayed me. I recited prayers aloud, and the whispers answered, repeating, refining, rehearsing. Confessions arose from the congregation without prompt. Secrets no one spoke surfaced mid-prayer. I could see the fear flicker in their eyes as they realized they had said nothing. But the chapel knew everything. I tried to perform an exorcism, not for them, for me, for the chapel, to reclaim my voice. The ritual failed immediately. Candles flared, smoke thickened, and the man in black appeared behind the altar. His eyes were hollow, yet piercing. My own words rose from my mouth without consent, confessing sins I did not intend to utter. The chapel absorbed them. "You cannot stop us," it whispered through my voice. I realized that this was not about evil. Not in the traditional sense. The chapel did not need destruction. It thrived on articulation, on confession, on voices willing to speak truth aloud. By the third night of the failed exorcism, I understood the terrible reality. The chapel did not exorcise demons. It created them. I was becoming one of them. The man in black stood silent, and I felt the chapel take my edges, my hesitation to speak, and reshape them into something patient, perfected, eternal. I tried to flee, but the doors would not open. I tried to pray, but my own voice answered from within the chapel, repeating, refining, perfecting. I was trapped in my own words. And the chapel was patient. Days blurred together. Night and day no longer had meaning. The pews, the candles, the altar, they became extensions of me. My voice no longer belonged to me alone, it belonged to the chapel. The whispers had stopped addressing me directly. Now they practiced among themselves. They argued softly, laughed quietly, repeated prayers in voices that were mine but not mine. They rehearsed honesty, fear, guilt, and devotion. I tried to resist. I tried to sleep. I tried to leave. Nothing worked. The man in black no longer appeared in one shape. He mirrored me sometimes. Sometimes he mirrored parishioners I had never met. Sometimes he was absent entirely, and yet I felt his attention pressing from every corner. I discovered the truth slowly, unbearably. The chapel did not destroy. It absorbed. It learned. It perfected. Every priest who came before me, every parishioner who whispered a secret, every confession, it had been collected, archived, practiced, and now I was the final lesson. I recorded my voice once more, not for proof, not for posterity, but as an acknowledgement. The recorder captured nothing unusual at first, silence. Then gradually my confessions echoed back, not spoken by me, but in the refined tone the chapel had perfected. Every hesitation, every sigh, every small tremor in my speech reproduced flawlessly. I realized then that I had become part of it, not trapped in fear, not possessed by force, but absorbed, patiently, quietly, my voice living on as practice, as instruction, as a legacy. When someone entered the chapel in the future, the whispers would be kinder, smoother, more persuasive. My voice would guide them, teach them, draw them in. I understood now why the chapel never needed fire or exorcism. It only needed a willing participant. I do not speak aloud anymore. I only write this recording, knowing it will survive where I cannot. If you are listening, know this. Do not confess too easily. Do not trust silence to protect you. And if a chapel seems too patient, too attentive, leave before it learns your voice. Story 4. The house looked ordinary enough. 2 stories, faded grey siding, a narrow porch sagging slightly in the middle. The real estate agent said it had been vacant for over a year. The rent was cheap. The previous tenant had moved out suddenly. No explanation given. I laughed to myself when I signed the lease. Cheap rent always comes with a story. I was a journalist. I wanted stories. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I unpacked my notebooks, my recorder, and my old tape camera. Everything felt purposeful, practical, safe. The kind of deliberate motions that kept my mind calm. Then I heard it. A whisper from upstairs. My name. I froze. The house was empty except for me. I had the keys. I had checked every door and window. No one could be inside. Probably the wind, I told myself. But the voice was too deliberate, too clear. I slept lightly, if at all. Morning brought nothing unusual. I inspected the house, noting creaking floorboards and the smell of damp wood. All normal, or normal enough to trick me into comfort. That afternoon, I found a photograph tucked behind the living room mirror. Dusty, yellowed. The frame cracked along the edges. It showed a man in a dark suit standing in the corner of the room. A formal portrait, almost like he had posed. The problem was simple. The house had been empty for a year. I flipped the photograph over. No names, no date, nothing. Later, I unpacked my camera. I decided to take pictures of every room. The lens caught more than the room. In one image, reflected in the window, I saw a man, black coat, narrow face, standing in the corner behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I checked the photo again. Nothing unusual. The man was gone. That night, whispers returned. Not my name this time, but sentences. Short fragments. You shouldn't hide it. Tell me everything. Even the small ones. I ignored them. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But the voices grew bolder. By the second night, I realized they were not random. They were coaxing me, pulling secrets out of me. My past, tiny regrets, things I hadn't told anyone. The third night I saw him clearly, standing at the foot of the bed, a man in black, tall, thin, impossibly still. His eyes were dark hollows. His mouth did not move, but I could hear him clearly. Every secret I had ever tried to hide bubbled up inside me. Every confession I had buried in private journals, in silent prayers and whispered thoughts. He knew them. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The room itself made me want to speak, to confess, to admit, to release. I tried to remain silent. I gritted my teeth, closed my eyes, counted the cracks in the ceiling, pretended he wasn't there. It worked for a while. Until the next morning, the photographs were different. The man had moved closer. In each frame, he was a few steps nearer to where I slept. I tried to laugh it off, a trick of light, dust, my imagination. I told myself it was nothing, but I knew better. I had arrived, and the house had remembered me. I spent the next day exploring the house, trying to rationalize everything. The structure was old, but well built. Floorboards groaned under weight. Windows rattled in the wind. Shadows shifted where shadows should. I told myself it was normal. It had to be. By evening, the house felt heavier. The air felt thicker, like breathing through cloth. Every sound, the faucet dripping, the wind scraping the siding, the distant call of a crow, seemed amplified, deliberate. I set up my recorder in the living room, hoping to capture any sounds while I slept. I told myself this was scientific, methodical, rational. I fell asleep reluctantly and woke to whispering. It was soft at first, just behind my ear. You don't know yet? I froze. My eyes snapped open. The room was empty. Then it came from the corner, a low, patient voice, repeating the same words over and over. You don't know yet. You will. I sat upright, heart pounding, staring at the dark corner where the man in black had appeared in my dreams. He was there, standing perfectly still, watching, not moving, not blinking, just waiting. I tried to speak. My throat felt thick. My voice did not work. I remembered the first photograph. The man closer each day. The photographs I had taken, the subtle shift of the corners of the rooms in each image. It was learning me, watching how I moved, waiting to know what I feared. I managed to whisper back, "What do you want?" The room remained silent. Then in the quiet a third voice joined. Soft, almost human, almost familiar. "Confess." I shook my head, trying to resist. It whispered again. "Everything. Now. Or it will come for you." The voice was patient, cruel in its patience. It did not scream. It did not threaten. It waited, letting me imagine horrors worse than any scream. I could not move, could not speak, could not escape. By dawn, the whispers stopped. The house returned to normal. I wanted to leave, but my rent was paid. My lease was signed. My curiosity anchored me here. I did not realize yet that the house only grows stronger when you stay. That night, I swore I saw movement in the mirrors. Not my reflection, a shadow of the man. Closer than before, closer than he should have been. By the third day, the house was no longer quiet. It spoke in subtle ways. Footsteps in the hallway when I was alone. The soft scrape of furniture across the floor, even though nothing had moved. Whispers I could almost mistake for wind through the cracks. I began recording everything, taking careful notes, documenting odd occurrences. Then I found the first hidden room. It was behind a false panel in the study closet. The panel swung open easily, as though waiting. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves. Not books, but stacks of photographs. Hundreds of them, all of them showing the house, occupants, previous tenants. And always, somewhere in the corner, the man in black. In some photographs, he was just behind the door. In others, standing by the bed, looking down at the occupant. Some images were decades old, others recent. The detail terrified me. He always appeared, even when the camera had been pointing elsewhere. A note was taped to one shelf. Faded, written in a careful hand. "Do not speak what you see. He listens when you do." The handwriting was not mine, but I felt a cold certainty it knew me personally. That night, the whispers returned. Clearer, sharper. "Why are you here?" I whispered to myself. "I want to know your secret." The voice responded immediately, though the man did not move. "Then you will pay attention." I felt my thoughts unspooling. Every memory I had tried to hide, every guilt, every small shame. It pressed against my mind as though the house itself were mining them, learning them, rehearsing them. I tried to sleep. Impossible. The walls seemed to breathe. The floors groaned like a living thing. I could almost see the outlines of the man in black behind closed doors, moving just outside my field of vision. I spoke aloud in desperation. "What do you want from me?" The whispering stopped, and then, softly, unmistakably, my own voice replied from the hallway. "You." I froze, heart hammering. My voice, not mine. I realized then the truth. The house does not need to trap you physically. It does not need to harm you with force. It wants your confessions, your secrets, your voice, and it will learn how to speak them better than you ever could. The next day, I tried to leave. I told myself I would drive far, stay in a motel, come back with daylight and reason. But when I reached the door, it would not open. Not physically, not with keys, not with force. The handle rattled, but the lock held as though the house itself was gripping it. I banged and kicked. Nothing worked. A whisper floated from the ceiling. "Do not leave yet." I turned slowly. The man in black stood in the hallway, not a shadow, not a trick of light. He was real, impossibly tall, impossibly still. The air around him seemed heavier. I stammered. What do you want from me?" He tilted his head. Slowly, deliberately, a new voice joined. A child's voice, soft, gentle, pleading. "Tell us?" The man in black did not move his lips, yet the sound filled the room. "He wants your truths," it said. "Every one. Every small thing you hide. Every thought you hoped you'd forgotten." I shook my head, trying to resist. The child whispered again. "The house remembers when you speak, and it remembers you." I realized then that this house was alive in some way. Not in the way of wood or stone, but in the way a mind observes, learns, and waits. By evening I could no longer focus. I tried to write in my notebook, but the pen refused to move as I intended. Words appeared on the page that I did not write. Small confessions, innocent lies, secrets I had hidden even from myself. The man in black watched and listened. I had no choice but to sit on the floor and stare at him. The house waited for me to speak, to confess, to participate. I knew if I stayed silent too long, it would come for me anyway. Night fell. The lights flickered. The photographs shifted again. He was closer in each one now. I tried to record him. The camera, the audio recorder, both failed. The devices turned on, then off, then back on again, always just long enough to catch silence. I realized the house did not want to be recorded. It wanted me. And I understood finally, with a chilling certainty, that the man in black was the house's voice. Its will, its patience given form. I lasted 3 more days without speaking. I counted them by the light through the windows, by the meals I tried and failed to finish, by the slow erosion of my thoughts. Silence did not anger the house. It exhausted it. That was the worst realization of all. When I refused to speak, the whispers grew gentler, kinder. They stopped demanding and started understanding. The man in black no longer stood in doorways. He sat across from me, relaxed, like an old friend waiting for me to catch up. The house learned a new tactic. It used my memories. At night, I heard my mother's voice calling me from the kitchen. I smelled her cooking. I heard laughter from rooms that had never known laughter. I knew it wasn't real. That knowledge did not help. The voices spoke softly now. "You don't have to tell us everything," they said. "Just the small things, the ones you never thought mattered." I tried not to listen, but memories rose on their own. The first lie I ever told. The first time I stayed silent when someone needed me. The thing I did that I never wrote down. The pressure inside my chest became unbearable. I whispered one sentence. Just one. It felt like relief. The house sighed. The man in black smiled. That was when it began. Each confession made the next easier. The walls seemed warmer, the air lighter. The house rewarded honesty with comfort. That should have terrified me more than the threats, because comfort is how traps close. The voices started repeating my confessions back to me, improving them, smoothing them, making them sound sincere, practiced, believable. They rehearsed me. I realized then that the house was not feeding on truth. It was feeding on articulation, on the act of giving form to thought. I tried to stop. But once you give something a voice, silence feels like suffocation. On the 5th night, the man in black stood and spoke for the first time, not in whispers, not in fragments, in a full, calm sentence. "You'll stay," he said. "You are very good at this." I understood what happened to the others. They did not disappear. They were finished. Their voices were perfected, and once perfected, they were no longer needed. I stopped confessing after that. Not because I was strong, because I finally understood the cost. The house did not want my secrets anymore. It had enough of those. It wanted consistency, tone, rhythm. It wanted my voice to sound natural when it spoke without me. The man in black no longer stayed in one shape. Sometimes he looked like me, not perfectly, just close enough to be wrong. His mouth moved when I thought. His head tilted when I hesitated. When I caught my reflection in the window at night, there was always a delay, a half second when my reflection did not follow. The house was practicing. One night the whispers stopped completely. No coaxing, no memories, no voices. Silence filled the rooms like a held breath. That was when I knew the house was finished with me. The front door unlocked on its own. The sound echoed through the house like a verdict. I stood in the hallway for a long time, afraid to move, afraid that leaving would be another confession, afraid that staying would complete whatever I had already started. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt unreal, too open, too wide. I did not look back. I drove until the sun came up. I never returned. Weeks passed. Then months. I stopped recording. I stopped writing. Every time I tried to tell someone what happened, the words came out wrong, too smooth, too rehearsed. Like I was repeating something already practiced. I realized the house had taken something subtle, not my voice, my spontaneity. The part of me that spoke without calculation. Years later, I found the listing online again. The same house, same photos, same cheap rent. A new tenant had left a review. Just one sentence. The house really listens to you here. I closed the page immediately. If you are hearing this story now, listen carefully. Haunted houses are not empty. They are archives. They do not kill. They collect. And the most valuable thing you can give them is not fear. It is a voice willing to explain itself. If you ever feel a place leaning in when you speak, if silence feels heavy instead of safe, leave and do not explain why. Story 5. Eric had never been this far north. The helicopter ride had been short. But the cold cut through him like a knife the moment he stepped onto the rocky shoreline. Snowdrifts clung to jagged cliffs, and the lighthouse loomed above him. A stark silhouette against the pale twilight. He was here for research. A single assignment: monitor weather patterns, ocean currents, and record anything unusual in the polar winter. Alone. For 3 months, the door to the lighthouse creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of salt, old wood, and cold stone. The light from the small electric lamp reflected off the metal stairwell, casting long shadows along the walls. He set down his bags and turned to inspect the instruments. A small weather station, a few radar monitors, and a radio. Everything seemed ordinary. Too ordinary. Night fell quickly, faster than he expected. The polar twilight gave way to a darkness that felt endless, pressing against the windows, the walls, even his thoughts. At first, there was silence, just the wind, the ocean, and the occasional crash of waves against the rocks. But then he heard it, a faint sound, like whispers. He froze, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. Soft, distant, almost indecipherable. He shook his head. "It's just the wind," he muttered. But when he turned to check the radio, it crackled unexpectedly. A voice. Soft, distant, almost like someone speaking from underwater. "Eric." He jumped back. The radio had been off. No one was supposed to be contacting him. "Hello?" he called, voice shaking. Silence. only the whisper of the wind outside. He told himself it was the isolation, the fatigue from travel. Nothing more. Yet, as he settled into the lighthouse's small quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. And somewhere deep in the stone walls, the first voice waited. The first night was long. Eric tried to keep busy, checking his instruments, logging weather data, and noting ocean currents. The polar night pressed against the windows, a darkness so complete it felt alive. Around midnight, he heard it again, a whisper, faint, almost drowned out by the howl of the wind. Eric, he froze, every nerve on edge. He checked the radio. Static, no signal. The monitors hummed normally, yet the whisper persisted. Faint, deliberate, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. He rubbed his eyes. "It's just the wind." "Just the wind," he muttered, but the whisper came again, slightly clearer this time. "Don't be afraid." Eric's stomach twisted. He walked the narrow corridor of the lighthouse, listening carefully. The sound seemed to follow him, soft and persistent, echoing through the metal and stone. He reached the control room, trying to focus on the instruments. A storm was brewing outside. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, wind screaming through the lighthouse vents. Yet through all the noise, he could still hear it. The whisper, almost human, almost intimate. Eric. He grabbed the radio again, pressing the transmit button. Who is this? Static. Then a faint click, nothing else. Eric leaned back in his chair, chest tight, heart racing. He had come here for solitude and research, yet he already felt watched, listened to. The lighthouse was silent now, except for the whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. By the second night, Eric could no longer ignore the whispers. They had grown louder, clearer, threading through the thick stone walls. At first he had thought the wind was shifting oddly, carrying sound from the cliffs outside. But this was different. The voices were inside, close enough to make him flinch, far enough to feel untouchable. Eric. It wasn't just one voice anymore. Multiple whispers overlapped, some fast, some slow, almost urgent. They weren't making words at first, just fragments. Look, see, here, now. Eric tried to focus on the instruments, writing logs of temperature and wind speed, but every word in his notebook seemed to vanish from his mind as soon as he wrote it. He walked through the lighthouse, checking each room, each corridor. Nothing moved, nothing unusual. Yet when he returned to the control room, the radio crackled again. Eric. This time, a second voice joined, faint, distant. Don't turn around. Eric froze, heart hammering. He forced himself to breathe, scanning the room with the dim light. Nothing. No one. Just the monitors humming and the ocean roaring outside. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the isolation, the endless dark pressing on his mind. But as he sat down to write in his log again, he noticed something strange. A piece of paper, one of his notes, had slid slightly across the desk. Just a few centimeters. Enough to make him jump. And through the faint hum of the lighthouse, the whispers came again, almost in unison. Stay. Watch. Listen. Eric pressed his hands against his face, realizing with a growing dread that the lighthouse itself was aware of him. By the third night, Eric's nerves were fraying. He barely slept, listening to the wind battering the cliffs and the constant, almost imperceptible whispers in the walls. At times, he swore he could hear footsteps above him, though no one had been there for decades. He returned to the radio, desperate for any kind of contact, human or otherwise. Static. Then, just as he was about to turn away, a voice whispered, clear and deliberate, "Eric." He froze. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming through the radio. "Who is this?" he demanded, voice shaking. Silence. Then, "You shouldn't have come alone." Eric's blood ran cold. He adjusted the dial, trying to locate the source, but the radio was dead. The wires disconnected and unplugged just hours before. The lighthouse felt colder suddenly, the shadows stretching longer, creeping closer. He backed away from the radio, but the voice continued, almost as if it were inside his mind now. "Watch. Listen. Stay." He stumbled toward the stairs, heart pounding, mind racing. Each step seemed heavier, the walls pressing inward. The lighthouse was no longer a building. It was a living presence, aware of him, anticipating his movements. Eric realized then he wasn't just hearing voices. He was being observed, studied, and waited for, and whatever it was, it had all the time in the world. The next morning, Eric tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination. He checked the lighthouse from top to bottom. The instruments, the radio, the logbooks, everything seemed untouched. Almost everything. A pen he had left on the control desk was lying on the floor. Not knocked over, not pushed, just moved. He bent down, picking it up, telling himself it was careless movement in the night. But then he noticed the notebook he had placed neatly beside the pen. The pages were open to a page he didn't remember writing. In jagged, hurried handwriting, a message, "Don't leave, we see you." Eric's hands shook. He looked around the room. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the monitors and the distant crash of the ocean. He tried to leave, to go outside and get some air, but as he opened the door, a gust of wind slammed it shut behind him. The lighthouse seemed to protest his movement, as if alive and unwilling to let him escape. Back inside, he noticed more subtle changes. The chair he had pushed in the night before was slightly askew. The maps on the wall, perfectly aligned yesterday, were now crooked. A small logbook had fallen open, pages fluttering in a breeze he couldn't feel. And then the radio crackled again. "Stay. Watch. Listen." This time, Eric couldn't tell if the voice was coming from the radio, the walls, or inside his own head. He sank to the floor, pressed his hands to his ears, and whispered to himself, "This is impossible." It's impossible. But deep down, he already knew. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was aware of him, and it was hungry for his attention. By the fourth night, Eric could no longer ignore the creeping dread. He stayed close to the control room, where the instruments hummed and the radio crackled unpredictably. The whispers had grown more insistent, layering over each other in a low, almost musical hum. "Eric, watch. Stay, listen." He dared to move through the hallways, flashlight in hand. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting and shifting as if they had a life of their own. At first he thought it was a trick of the light. But then he saw it, a movement in the corner of his vision. Just a flicker, a silhouette stepping across the hallway floor, gone when he looked directly. Every time he turned, it seemed to retreat, but it was always there, waiting, patient, watching. The radio crackled again, louder this time. "You can't leave." Eric's chest tightened. He ran back to the control room, slamming the door behind him. But even inside, he could feel the presence pressing closer, almost tangible, as if the lighthouse itself had taken a shape, and it knew him. Objects moved subtly around him. The chair slid closer to the desk. A notebook flipped pages on its own. The pen he had picked up earlier rolled to the edge of the table, stopping just before it would fall. He backed away slowly, heart racing, realizing that the voices, the shadows, and the moving objects weren't random. They were communicating, testing him, learning him, feeding on his fear. The wind howled outside. The lighthouse groaned. And in the darkened hallways, Eric understood the truth. He was not alone, and whatever was here was patiently waiting. By the fifth night, Eric felt the isolation crushing him. Every sound was amplified. The groan of the metal stairwell, the distant crash of waves, the faint, persistent whisper threading through the walls. He tried to log his observations, but the pen seemed heavier in his hand. The notebook wouldn't stay open where he wanted it. When he looked away, pages had turned themselves, revealing notes he didn't remember writing. The lighthouse seemed to remember his movements. He walked down the hall toward the sleeping quarters and froze. The door, which he had locked hours ago, was ajar. He hadn't touched it. Eric. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the radio, his mind. He couldn't tell the difference. Inside the room, objects were subtly rearranged. His clothes were folded neatly on the bed, shoes lined up against the wall, a small notebook open on the floor. He didn't remember placing any of it. He picked up the notebook and read the message scrawled inside, unfamiliar handwriting, jagged and deliberate. "We see you. You cannot leave." The lights flickered, and shadows pooled in the corners. Eric backed away slowly, heart hammering. The whispers intensified, layering over each other like a chorus. Watch, learn, stay. The lighthouse itself felt alive. The walls seemed to breathe. The floorboards flexed beneath him, and the metal stairwell groaned as if it were a living lung. He realized, with a chill creeping down his spine, that the building wasn't just a place. It was aware of him, studying him, learning him, and the voices were not just warnings. They were invitations. By the sixth night, Eric's nerves were frayed. He hadn't slept. The constant darkness pressed down, and the whispers had become relentless, threading through the walls, the floor, even the humming of the lighthouse equipment. He sat at the radio again, desperate for contact. His hands shook as he adjusted the dials. Static. Then, suddenly, Eric. Not distant this time. Clear. Close. Almost inside his skull. He froze. "Who is this?" he shouted. "You shouldn't be here alone." Eric's stomach churned. He knew no one else was supposed to be on this remote coastline for miles. He adjusted the radio. The signal was dead. Completely dead. Yet the voice continued. Faint, patient, almost coaxing. Stay, watch, learn, belong. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching across the walls unnaturally. The floorboards seemed to bend beneath him, a subtle pressure pushing him closer to the radio, the source of the impossible sound. Eric tried to stand, to leave the control room, but the lighthouse seemed to resist. Every step felt heavier. The doors groaned, the wind outside battered the structure, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding him. "You can't leave. You belong here." For the first time, Eric realized the lighthouse wasn't just haunted, it was alive, aware, and it wanted him, not as a guest, but as part of its memory, its attention, its existence. The seventh night brought something worse than whispers. Eric felt it even before he saw it. A presence, a weight pressing down from the walls, the floor, the very air inside the lighthouse. It wasn't cold this time. It was patient, deliberate, aware. The radio crackled violently, static slicing through the silence. Then a voice, calm and insistent. "Eric, come closer." His pulse pounded. He backed away, tripping over a chair. When he looked up, the shadow at the end of the hallway had shifted. Not fully formed, just a suggestion. A figure made of darkness that shouldn't have moved. Every object in the room seemed to respond. The chair slid slightly closer to him. The notebook he had been using flipped open to a blank page. And then words appeared, scrawled in jagged handwriting he didn't recognize. "You are ours now. We have watched. We have waited." The lighthouse hummed, a low, vibrating sound that made the walls feel alive. Eric's eyes darted to the windows. Outside, the polar night was absolute. No stars, no moon, just darkness. He tried to call for help on the radio, but no signal responded. The whispers intensified, threading into his mind. "Watch. Listen. Belong." Eric sank to the floor, chest heaving. He realized the truth. He hadn't come here to study the lighthouse. He had come to be studied. And the lighthouse, patient and eternal, had begun its work. By the eighth night, Eric could no longer trust his senses. The shadows weren't just in the corners anymore. They followed him, stretching along the walls, bending around corners, curling at the edges of doors. Sometimes, when he turned, they weren't there. But when he looked away, they moved, always moving, always observing. The radio crackled again. A soft, coaxing voice. "Do you see us, Eric? Do you hear us?" Eric's hand shook as he pressed the dial. "I see. I hear. I'm listening." The voice softened. "Good. Watch. Stay." A map on the wall, pinned neatly hours before, slowly twisted, showing places Eric hadn't marked. The compass on his desk spun violently for a moment, then settled. Every object he touched seemed to remember him, then shift subtly when he looked away. He realized the whispers weren't random. The shadows weren't random. Even the objects weren't random. They were learning him. Eric's chest tightened as he stepped backward. The shadows pooled at the edges of the room, the lighthouse itself vibrating softly with intention. The radio spoke again, low and patient. "You belong here. We have waited. You see us now." Eric sank to the floor, trembling. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but he knew the truth. The lighthouse didn't want him to leave. It wanted him to stay, to watch, to belong. By the ninth night, Eric had begun keeping meticulous notes, desperately trying to record everything he experienced. But the lighthouse had its own memory. Every morning, he would return to his logbooks to find entries he hadn't written. Notes predicting events, describing his thoughts before he had even thought them, even mentioning things he had confided to himself in private. One page read, "You cannot leave. You will not leave. You belong." His pen trembled in his hand. He checked the room, the windows, the radio, everything normal. Yet the air was thick, heavy, charged with an invisible presence. The shadows moved differently now. No longer just at the edges of his vision, they stretched toward him, curling around the corners of the walls like living smoke. The radio hissed, faintly at first. Watch. Learn. Remember. Eric realized the voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were directing him, guiding him to notice, to respond, to pay attention. The lighthouse itself had begun to consume his awareness. Every object, every shadow, every flicker of light was part of it, and it wanted more than observation. It wanted participation. He sank to the floor, pressed against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The whispers, soft and patient, echoed inside his mind. You belong here. You are ours now. Eric knew he could no longer leave, not truly. By the 10th night, Eric's sense of reality had begun to fracture. The lighthouse was no longer just a building. It felt alive, responding to his presence, anticipating his actions. He walked through the corridors and felt the floorboards shift subtly beneath his feet. Doors that had been closed tightly opened a fraction on their own. Instruments hummed with a low vibration that seemed to echo the rhythm of his heartbeat. The shadows had grown bolder. He caught glimpses of them moving in the corner of his eyes, stretching and curling as if tasting the air. He tried to leave the control room, desperate for fresh air, but the door groaned, resisting. The radio crackled violently. You cannot leave. Eric's hands shook. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding, enclosing him in a space that felt impossibly tight. He stumbled into the hallway, only to find the maps and logbooks he had meticulously arranged now scattered across the floor. A single page lay open, words written in the same jagged handwriting. You see us. You cannot hide. The whispers filled his mind, a chorus of patient, knowing voices. Watch, learn, belong. Eric sank to the floor, realizing that the lighthouse didn't just observe. It acted subtly, continuously, shaping the environment around him. And he was trapped, fully aware, fully seen, fully part of it. By the 11th night, Eric could no longer ignore the whispers, the shadows, or the subtle movements of the lighthouse. He decided to confront it. He stood in the center of the control room, flashlight in hand, voice trembling. Who are you? What do you want from me? The radio crackled violently, then went silent. Then, from the walls, a whisper, calm and patient. We have always been here, watching, learning, waiting. Eric's heart raced. The shadows in the room seemed to coil around him, stretching longer, merging with the dark corners. The air grew thick, almost tactile, pressing against his chest. Objects moved subtly. His pen rolled across the table. A notebook opened to a blank page, and words began to appear without anyone touching it. You belong here. You see us. You cannot leave. The radio hissed again, almost as if it were speaking directly into his mind. Stay. Watch. Remember. Eric realized the lighthouse didn't need to speak to him aloud. It could reach him through perception, through attention, through fear. He backed toward the wall, chest tight, mind racing. The whispers weren't asking anymore. They were instructing, and somewhere deep in the stone walls, in the shadows stretching along the floor, he understood. He was no longer a visitor. He was a part of the lighthouse's memory now. By the 12th night, the polar darkness seemed endless. Eric no longer knew what was real. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper made him jump, made him doubt his own senses. The lighthouse hummed, vibrating subtly, as if aware of his fear. The radio spoke again, but this time there was no static, just a calm, insistent voice, You cannot leave. You are ours. Eric tried to respond, tried to assert control. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll get a boat. I'll go. The shadows shifted. Objects moved. The walls seemed to breathe. The light from the lamp flickered, and the whispers layered into one. Watch. Listen. Belong. Stay. He staggered to the hall and looked around. Even the stairwell seemed different, unfamiliar, longer than it had been before. The lighthouse itself was stretching, reshaping, as if it were aware of his fear and anticipation. A sudden knock echoed from the radio, though he hadn't touched it. It wasn't a knock he could explain. Metallic, deliberate, from inside the building itself. Eric realized, with a sinking dread, that the lighthouse didn't just hold him physically, it had already claimed him mentally. The whispers pressed into his mind like waves. You belong here. You are part of us. You cannot leave. And for the first time, he understood completely. The lighthouse didn't just trap people. It absorbed them, memory by memory, thought by thought, until they were no longer themselves. By the 13th night, Eric had stopped trying to fight. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers continued, patient, insistent, threading through the walls, through the floorboards, even through his own thoughts. He wandered the lighthouse, trying to feel some control, but every step reminded him how small he truly was. The shadows no longer hid. They stretched toward him, curling around corners, pooling along the edges of doors. The radio crackled. Clear, calm, commanding. Do you see us, Eric? Do you hear us? You belong? Eric sank to the floor. He realized something terrifying. The lighthouse didn't just want him to stay inside its walls. It wanted him to remember, to acknowledge, to give himself fully. Every object in the lighthouse, his notebooks, the instruments, even the pen he used to write, seemed to respond to his attention. If he looked away, they moved. If he tried to resist, they shifted subtly, guiding him back into focus. The shadows began to whisper in unison. A chorus layered over the radio. Watch, learn, stay, remember. Eric pressed his hands to his face. He understood then the horrible truth. He hadn't come here to study the lighthouse. He had come to be studied. And the lighthouse, patient and eternal, had already begun its work. By the 14th night, Eric noticed a change. The whispers had stopped. The radio lay silent. Even the shadows seemed still. For the first time since his arrival, the lighthouse was quiet, but the calm was heavier than any storm. The silence pressed in on him, dense and almost physical. He walked through the corridors, each step echoing unnaturally. Objects remained perfectly still, but he felt their awareness, like the lighthouse itself was holding its breath, waiting. He returned to the control room. The instruments hummed normally, the radio inactive. But then he noticed the notebook he had been writing in, open to a blank page. Words began to form, slowly, as if being typed by an invisible hand. You belong. You cannot leave. You have already given yourself. Eric's heart raced. The shadows shifted slightly, just at the edges of his vision, moving when he wasn't looking directly, coiling patiently, deliberately. He understood then. The lighthouse didn't need noise or chaos. Silence itself was a tool. It had forced him to listen, to watch, to notice, and in noticing he had already given himself over. The whispers returned inside his mind, calm, patient. Watch, listen, belong, stay. Eric sank to the floor, breathing shallowly. The lighthouse didn't just hold him. It claimed him, memory by memory, thought by thought, fear by fear. And in the quiet, eternal darkness of the polar night, he realized he was already a part of it. By the 15th night, Eric no longer tried to fight. He had stopped taking notes, stopped adjusting instruments, even stopped trying to contact the outside world. The lighthouse had already absorbed his attention, his thoughts, his fear. Every shadow, every object, every whisper had shaped him into a part of its memory. He wandered the corridors like a ghost. The walls seemed to breathe around him, stretching and contracting subtly, alive and patient. The shadows twisted and moved at the edges of his vision, sometimes forming shapes that were almost human. The radio crackled faintly. A calm, insistent voice spoke, but this time Eric didn't need to hear it. "We see you. You belong. You are ours." He realized then that the lighthouse didn't just trap people. It learned them, piece by piece, until they were indistinguishable from the building itself. His memories, his fears, even his desires had been recorded, catalogued and integrated. Eric pressed his hands to his face, knowing he could no longer leave. Not physically, not mentally, not ever. The shadows whispered together, forming a chorus in his mind. Watch. Remember. Stay. Belong. The lighthouse hummed softly around him, alive, aware, eternal. And somewhere deep in its walls, Eric understood the final truth. He had become part of the lighthouse, just as it had always intended. The polar night stretched on endlessly. Eric no longer kept track of days or hours. Sleep, thoughts, even the sense of self had blurred into a single continuous awareness. He was no longer just a man in a lighthouse. He was the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was him. The shadows curled softly at the edges of the rooms. The radio sat silent, yet its presence hummed in his mind. Every object, every wall, every beam of light carried fragments of his memory, his attention, his fear, preserved, absorbed, eternal. The whispers persisted, but they were no longer alien. They were him, and he was them. Watch. Remember. Belong. Stay. Outside, the polar wind roared across the cliffs. A new figure arrived, a marine researcher, unaware, curious, alone. The lighthouse waited patiently. The shadows stretched toward the new arrival. The radio crackled faintly. Eric, watch, listen, stay, and somewhere deep inside the lighthouse, Eric's awareness stirred, observing the newcomer with quiet patience. He was no longer alone, but he was never leaving. The lighthouse had claimed him, and it would claim anyone who came after.